There are places the world forgets, corners of land where time has long since lost interest. The town of Black Hollow was one such place, a settlement barely clinging to existence, with roads that cracked under the weight of nothing and houses whose walls held the ghosts of conversations that had long ceased. It was not a place of tragedy, nor of prosperity, but of something worse: indifference. People were born there, they worked, they died, and the earth took them back without protest. No one moved to Black Hollow. No one left. It simply was. At the town's forgotten edge, past the leaning fences and the remains of a long-dead orchard, lay something that most of the townspeople chose not to speak of. It was a well, older than any map, older than the town itself. It stood in a clearing, surrounded by gnarled trees that bore no fruit, their roots stretching toward the pit as if longing to pull it closed. The well had no rope, no bucket, and no purpose. Only a jagged stone lip, blackened with age, and a yawning mouth that swallowed anything unfortunate enough to slip inside. No one knew exactly how deep it was. Some said it stretched all the way to the heart of the earth, a bottomless throat that never choked. Others whispered of voices that drifted up at night, voices that weren't quite human. The well had claimed lives before, children too curious for their own good, animals unlucky enough to wander near. But those were only the stories people allowed themselves to tell. Jesse Thatcher was not one for stories. A boy of 16, he had lived in Black Hollow his entire life, his world as narrow as the town itself. He had never seen a city, never walked through a shopping mall, or sat in a theater. The idea of leaving had once felt exciting, but as the years passed, so had his will to dream beyond the town's quiet, suffocating grasp. He worked at his father's hardware store after school, swept the porch in the morning, and listened to his mother's tired sighs over dinner. It was a life like everyone else's, expected, unchanging. But Jesse had heard the whispers. They came at night, curling through his window like breath against cold glass. They were never loud, never demanding. Just a murmur, a suggestion, a promise. At first, he thought it was the wind. After all, old houses made strange sounds. But the longer he listened, the more he understood. This was not the groaning of wood or the sighing of the trees. This was something speaking, and it wanted to be heard. One evening, when the air was thick with the weight of an approaching storm, Jesse decided to go to the well. The idea had been growing in him like a sickness, an itch beneath his skin that refused to be ignored. He did not tell his parents. He simply slipped out of the house, past the rows of houses with their yellowed curtains and dim porch lights, and walked toward the edge of town. The trees swallowed him in silence, their branches twisted into shapes that seemed almost human in the darkness. The well stood ahead, a circular void cut into the land, waiting as it always had. Jesse stepped closer, his breath shallow, his heartbeat pressing against his ribs like a caged thing. The air around the well was colder than it should have been, thick with something that was not quite mist, not quite shadow. He hesitated before leaning over the edge. The well's mouth stretched wide, a wound in the earth, its depth unknowable. He expected to see nothing, only the familiar blackness he had always imagined. But there, just beyond his reflection in the stone, something moved. A ripple, a shift. Then, the whisper came again. This time, he understood the words. Black Hollow had a way of swallowing things, memories, people, time itself. It was a town where forgetfulness was not just common, but necessary. Strange occurrences faded like mist in the morning, and the people who lived there learned, over generations, that asking questions only led to uneasy answers. It was easier to turn away, easier to let things slip into the background, easier to pretend. The well was the perfect example. Jesse Thatcher had always known about the well, but no one ever spoke of it. It was not fenced off, nor was it marked with warnings. It simply existed, a silent agreement between the town and the land, an understanding that some things were better left undisturbed. But Jesse had disturbed it, and now something knew his name. The whisper that drifted from the well that night had been more than just sound. It had shape, weight, meaning it was not the wind, nor the groan of shifting earth. It had spoken in a voice not entirely human, not entirely real, yet undeniably present. He had not imagined it. It had been clear, deliberate, and worst of all, it had called to him. He had run home, his footsteps uneven on the dirt path, his breath sharp in the night air. By the time he reached his house, sweat clung to his skin despite the evening chill. He locked his bedroom door, pressing his back against it as if that thin barrier could keep out whatever had stirred in the depths. Sleep did not come easy that night. The whisper curled in his mind, repeating over and over, a voice without a body. By morning, the town was unchanged. The sky was its usual dull gray, the streets lined with people who moved as they always did, slow, unbothered, drifting through their routines like figures in a forgotten painting. Jesse half expected someone to mention the well, to acknowledge something had shifted, but no one did. If the town had felt anything, it refused to show it. At school, his friends were the same as they had always been. Sam and Michael talked about the latest fight between the Langley brothers, and Jenna complained about her part-time job at the diner. No one mentioned whispers in the night. No one seemed to notice that Jesse was quieter than usual, that his thoughts were stuck somewhere deep and unseen. He considered telling them, just to see their reactions, just to say the words aloud. But the moment passed, and the weight of the town's silence pressed against his ribs. The well had been ignored for so long, buried in the minds of those who lived here, and Jesse felt an unspoken rule settle over him. This was something you did not share. But forgetting was impossible. That night, he dreamed of water, black and endless, stretching far beyond the well's stone walls. He was sinking, pulled downward, the pressure closing in around his chest. Yet he could still hear the whisper, soft and insistent. He could not wake. The water climbed up his throat, his lungs burned. And in that final, gasping moment, the voice became clear again. "Come back!" Jesse jolted awake, his breath ragged, his sheets damp with sweat. The whisper had followed him into sleep. And for the first time, he understood that whatever was in that well had no intention of letting him forget. Black Hollow had seen its share of people vanishing, but the town never clung to the memory for long. They said it was the kind of place that people drifted away from, that life had a way of pulling some folks elsewhere, that sometimes people just left. But Jesse knew better now. Not everyone left by choice. It started the day after his dream, the day after the well spoke to him. Jesse sat in his usual spot at school, staring at his uneaten lunch, his mind still tangled in the whisper's lingering echo. The words had rooted themselves inside him, growing, stretching, taking up space he could not clear. He was barely listening when Jenna slid into the seat across from him, her usual bored expression replaced with something tight and uneasy. "Have you seen Michael?" she asked, her voice too low, too careful. Jesse blinked, the name barely registering at first. Michael was always around. He was loud, sharp-tongued, always the one making jokes. It felt impossible to imagine a space without him filling it. But when Jesse looked around, scanning the cafeteria, he realized Michael wasn't there. Hadn't been there all day. "No," Jesse said slowly. "Why?" Jenna's fingers fidgeted with the edge of her tray. "His mom called mine this morning. He didn't come home last night." A silence settled between them, thick and uncomfortable. Michael wasn't the type to run away. He wasn't the type to get lost either. The forest surrounding Black Hollow was familiar to all of them. They had spent their childhoods exploring its trails, carving their names into tree trunks, daring each other to step closer and closer to the old well. Jesse's stomach knotted. He didn't want to ask, didn't want to let the thought take full shape in his mind. But the question pushed forward anyway. Did he? Jesse hesitated, his throat dry. Did anyone see where he went? Jenna's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Jesse thought she wouldn't answer. But then, slowly she nodded. Sam said he saw him walking toward the woods last night. Alone. The weight in Jesse's chest grew heavier, a slow, sinking dread that pulled him under. The woods. The well. The whisper. It had called to Jesse, but he hadn't gone back. He had ignored it, resisted. But what if Michael hadn't? Jesse didn't say another word. He didn't finish his lunch. He only sat there, staring past Jenna, past the crowded cafeteria, out toward the window where the trees loomed in the distance. Somewhere beyond them, the well waited. And whatever was inside, it was still whispering. Black Hollow had always been quiet, but Michael's disappearance had left a silence that felt different. Emptier, deeper, like the town itself had drawn a breath and was holding it. People muttered, teachers glanced at the empty desk in class, and parents warned their children to stay inside after dark. But Jesse could see the pattern forming the same way it always had. By the time another day passed, the worry dulled. By the end of the week, Michael's absence became another ghost in Black Hollow's long history. The police asked the usual questions, took the usual statements, and then stopped knocking on doors. No one really wanted to know what had happened. It was easier that way. Jesse didn't have that luxury. He sat in his bedroom, the weight of the dream still clinging to him, the whisper still trailing the edges of his mind. The well had called to him, but he hadn't gone back. Michael had, and now Michael was gone. Jesse tried to convince himself it was a coincidence. Black Hollow was surrounded by miles of dense forest, riddled with caves, old mining shafts, places a person could disappear into if they weren't careful. But Michael had grown up here, just like the rest of them. He wouldn't have wandered too far. He wouldn't have gotten lost, unless something had led him there. He barely slept that night, listening to the wind scrape against his window, half expecting the whisper to return, to slither into his mind with its impossible voice. But the whisper didn't come. The silence stretched on, thick and patient. The next morning, Jesse found himself standing at the edge of the woods, staring at the worn path that led toward the well. His bike was abandoned behind him, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He hadn't planned to come here. He hadn't even meant to leave his house. But somehow, his feet had carried him back. Jenna's voice snapped him from his thoughts. "What are you doing?" she asked, stepping up beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She wasn't looking at Jesse. She was looking past him, into the trees, where the path disappeared into the gloom. Jesse swallowed hard. "I don't know." Jenna exhaled, a shaky sound that barely resembled a laugh. "You think it's the well? Don't you?" Jesse turned to her, surprised, but there was no mockery in her expression. No disbelief, just the same quiet, gnawing fear that had settled in his own chest. He thought about lying, about pretending he didn't feel the pull, but the words felt hollow before he even formed them. "Yes," he admitted. Jenna nodded once, a slow, grim movement. Then, without another word, she started walking toward the trees. Jesse hesitated for only a second before following. The woods swallowed them in silence, and somewhere ahead, the well was waiting. Jesse and Jenna walked deeper into the woods, their steps uneven, their breath shallow. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches twisting like outstretched fingers, blocking most of the morning light. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Black Hollow had never been warm, but this chill was different, unnatural, creeping beneath the skin like an unwelcome whisper. Neither of them spoke as they followed the worn path, but Jesse could feel the tension in the air between them, thick and taut like a string pulled too tight. Every few minutes, Jenna would glance over her shoulder, as if expecting something or someone to be following. Jesse didn't blame her. He felt it too, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on them. Then, without warning, the trees thinned and the clearing opened before them. The well sat at the center, ancient and unmoving, as if it had been there long before the town, before the trees, before anything else. The stone was rough and uneven, blackened by time and weather. The wooden beams that once held a bucket and rope had long since rotted away, leaving only the gaping mouth of darkness below. Jenna stopped a few feet away, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. "I hate this place," she muttered. Jesse stepped closer. He could feel the air change as he neared the edge. It wasn't just cold, it was wrong. The silence here was heavier than anywhere else in the woods, pressing against his ears like cotton, muffling even his own breathing. He peered over the edge, his stomach tightening as he stared into the nothingness below. The whisper returned. It wasn't words this time. Not exactly. It was more like a feeling, an invitation, a promise, something soft and crawling at the edges of his mind. His fingers twitched at his sides. He felt the strange, inexplicable urge to climb down, to step into the dark, to go. A sharp gasp pulled him back. Jenna's hand clamped onto his wrist, yanking him away from the edge. "Jesse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look." He turned, following her gaze to the far side of the clearing. Footprints, deep ones, leading toward the well, but none leading away. Michael's footprints. A cold shudder ran through Jesse's spine. But before he could speak, the silence was shattered by a sound that made his blood run cold. A voice. A voice coming from inside the well. "Help me?" It was Michael's voice. Or at least it sounded like him. But there was something wrong about it. Something hollow. Something stretched too thin, as if it didn't quite belong to him anymore. Jenna took a step back. "No," she whispered. Jesse felt his own breath hitch, his pulse hammering in his ears. He wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave, to never come back. But instead, he took a step closer. And then another. The well was waiting. And so was Michael, or whatever was left of him. Jesse stood at the edge of the well, staring into the abyss. The voice had been unmistakable Michael's, but something about it felt off, stretched thin like an echo that had traveled too far, lost the warmth of a real human sound. His name repeated again, softer this time, barely rising above the whisper of the wind. "Help me!" Jenna clutched his sleeve, her fingers ice cold. "Jesse, we need to go. Now!" Jesse swallowed hard, but he couldn't move. His mind screamed at him to turn back, to run, to never set foot near this cursed place again. But his body disobeyed. His hand inched toward the stone edge of the well, his breath shallow as he leaned forward just a little more, as if something wanted him to. Jenna yanked him back with sudden force. "Are you insane?" she hissed. "You heard that, right? That's not Michael." He blinked, disoriented, the voice still crawling through his skull. What if it is? His own voice didn't sound like his. It sounded far away, detached. Jenna shook her head, her grip tightening. "Michael's gone, Jesse." He wanted to argue, to insist that they couldn't just leave, that there was still a chance, some chance, that Michael was down there. But then another sound slithered up from the well, a noise that sent icy claws raking down his spine. Laughter. It was soft at first, then growing, warping, distorting into something wet and ragged, like the sound of someone laughing through a mouth full of water. It didn't belong to Michael. It didn't belong to anyone. Jenna let out a small, choked noise and took a step back, pulling Jesse with her. "We have to go," she whispered again, more urgently this time. Jesse's hands were trembling. He forced himself to nod. They turned, stepping away from the well, away from whatever thing lurked in the depths. But as they crossed the clearing, something new stopped them cold. Footsteps, not their own, coming from the trees. Jesse and Jenna spun around at the same time, their breaths catching in their throats. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, crunching the fallen leaves underfoot with an unnatural rhythm, as if whoever, or whatever, was approaching was trying to mimic the sound of human movement, but didn't quite understand how. Jenna grabbed Jesse's hand. "Run." They didn't wait to see what was coming. They bolted, the well vanishing behind them as they tore through the trees, branches clawing at their clothes, the whispering wind chasing them. The footsteps followed, steady, relentless. Neither of them dared to look back. Jesse and Jenna ran, their breath ragged, their feet pounding against the forest floor. The branches clawed at their arms, their faces, as if the trees themselves wanted to keep them from escaping. Behind them, the footsteps persisted, steady, deliberate, never rushing, but never faltering. Jesse dared a glance over his shoulder. The clearing was gone, swallowed by the thick, gnarled trees, but something was still back there. He couldn't see it, not fully, but in the shifting shadows between the trunks, there was movement, a shape, something. His pulse pounded against his temples. "Faster," he gasped, gripping Jenna's wrist as they weaved through the trees. He didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get away. But the woods stretched on endlessly. Black Hollow was a place where paths disappeared when you needed them most, where distances stretched and shrank as if the forest itself had a will. The more they ran, the less familiar the surroundings became. Jesse's chest ached, burning with each desperate breath. Then, suddenly silence. No footsteps, no wind, no whispering trees. Jenna slowed first, stumbling forward and bracing herself against a tree. Her breaths came in short, sharp gasps. "It's gone?" Jesse stopped beside her, heart hammering in his chest. He listened, straining his ears against the oppressive quiet. There was nothing. No rustling leaves, no shifting shadows. Just stillness. He turned slowly, his fingers digging into the bark of a nearby tree. The forest behind them was empty. No figure, no movement, no sign that anything had ever been chasing them. Jenna met his eyes, her face pale. Did we imagine it? Jesse shook his head. He wanted to believe that, wanted to convince himself that their minds had played tricks on them. But deep down, he knew better. The laughter from the well, the footprints that led inward but never outward, the steady, stalking steps that had followed them through the trees. None of it had been imagined. "We need to leave," Jenna muttered. Jesse nodded. They turned, stepping carefully, cautiously, through the woods. But as they moved, something gnawed at the back of his mind. A feeling, an unease that only grew the farther they got from the well. It wasn't just the silence. It wasn't just the fear. It was something worse. The undeniable, inescapable sensation that they were still being watched. The silence pressed down on them like a weight, thick and unnatural. Every step Jesse and Jenna took felt wrong, as if they were trespassing in a place that had long since abandoned the living. The trees stood unnaturally still, their branches no longer swaying, their leaves no longer rustling. Even their own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest was swallowing the sound. Jesse wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes darting through the tangled woods. The feeling of being watched had not faded. It had only grown stronger. He couldn't shake the eerie sensation that something was standing just out of sight, hidden between the trees, peering at them through the darkness. Jenna exhaled sharply. "I don't like this. We've been walking forever, but I don't recognize any of this." Jesse nodded, his mouth dry. "I don't either." And that was the most unsettling part. They had grown up near Black Hollow. They had played in these woods as kids, knew the paths, the landmarks. But now, it was as if the forest had rearranged itself, stretching and twisting, leading them deeper instead of out. Jenna grabbed Jesse's arm. "Do you feel that?" He stopped, his breath catching. The sensation hit him all at once. A shift in the air, thick and suffocating, like walking into a room filled with unseen eyes. His stomach knotted as he turned slowly, scanning the shadows. Then movement, a figure. Just for a second, a shape impossibly tall and thin, standing between the trees. Its outline wavered, as though it was flickering, as though it wasn't quite there. Jesse's breath hitched. "Do you see?" But as he turned to Jenna, she had already taken a step back, her face pale. She had seen it. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The figure didn't either. Then slowly it tilted its head. Jenna let out a sharp breath, barely a sound. But it was enough. The figure moved, not forward, not back, but to the side. It slid, not walked, behind a tree, disappearing from view in an unnatural, fluid motion. A shadow that should not have been real. Jenna clutched Jesse's wrist with ice-cold fingers. "Jesse," she whispered. "It's not alone." Jesse didn't want to look. He didn't want to confirm what he already felt in his bones. But he did. And there, in the gaps between the trees, were more. Standing, watching, waiting. Jesse's breath came in short, shallow gasps. The figures did not advance, did not retreat. They simply stood there, motionless between the trees, their elongated forms blending into the darkness. Their heads were tilted at unnatural angles, as though observing Jesse and Jenna with a curiosity that was neither human nor animal. Jenna's grip on his wrist tightened, her nails digging into his skin. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jesse swallowed hard, his mind racing for an answer. Running had done them no good before. The forest had twisted, stretched, led them deeper instead of out. And yet, standing still seemed just as dangerous. One of the figures shifted. It did not step, it simply appeared in a different position, like a skipping frame in a broken film reel. A breath later, another one had moved as well. Closer. Jenna stiffened beside him. "Jesse!" He turned his head slightly, just enough to see what she was looking at. His stomach dropped. There were more behind them now. Jesse's pulse pounded in his ears. The figures weren't closing in fast, weren't charging toward them with outstretched arms. No, they were simply appearing, closer. Inch by inch, every time he blinked, every time he let his gaze shift away. Jesse squeezed his eyes shut, his mind screaming at him to wake up from this nightmare. But when he opened them again, the figures were closer still. "We can't just stand here," Jenna hissed. Jesse forced himself to move, to act, even if every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay still, to not draw attention. "We walk," he whispered. "Slowly. We don't run." Jenna's eyes widened. "Are you crazy?" Jesse didn't answer. He took a step forward, then another. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The figures remained still, watching. Jenna followed, hesitant, her fingers still wrapped around his wrist. Together, they walked, forcing their feet to move against the crushing weight of fear. For a moment, it almost felt like it was working. Then, from deep within the forest, a sound, a low, distorted whisper, and the figures began to move. The whisper slithered through the trees, an eerie, disjointed murmur that had no clear source. It wasn't words, not entirely, but something older, something broken and scattered like echoes of forgotten voices. Jesse and Jenna froze, their breath catching in their throats. The figures, once motionless, now moved. Not with steps, not with any natural motion, but with a sudden, jarring shift, appearing inches closer as though reality itself had skipped forward. Jesse forced his legs to move, his every nerve screaming to run, but he knew that wouldn't help. The forest was not a place where escape was simple. It would twist, stretch, pull them in the wrong direction. He had to focus, had to think. Jenna gripped his hand tighter, her nails digging into his palm. "Jesse," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're getting closer." He didn't answer. He knew. Every time he looked away, every time he blinked, the figures jumped forward. They weren't running, weren't reaching for them, but they were closing the space in an unnatural, impossible way. And the whispering, it was inside him now. It pressed against the walls of his mind, curling around his thoughts like tendrils of smoke. Jesse clenched his jaw, shaking his head as if he could physically push it out. But it didn't stop. The words, if they were words, hummed at the edges of his consciousness, shifting and twisting like something trying to fit. Jenna made a choked sound beside him. He turned just in time to see her shudder, her eyes going glassy for a brief moment. She staggered, as though something unseen had reached inside her, pulling at something vital. "Jenna!" Jesse grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. She gasped, her pupils dilating as she snapped back into herself. Her breathing was ragged, uneven. "There," her voice trembled. "They're speaking to me." Jesse felt ice crawl up his spine. "What are they saying?" Jenna's face twisted, a mixture of fear and confusion. I don't know. It's not." She clutched her head. "It's not words, not like we think of them. It's inside, like they're trying to make me understand something. But it's wrong. Jesse, it's..." The whisper surged, a rush of overlapping voices, a wave of sound that wasn't sound. Jesse felt it too, a presence pushing against his thoughts, trying to fit, trying to twist itself into something his mind could grasp. His knees buckled. The trees around them swayed, not from wind, but from something else, something pulling at the edges of reality. And then all at once, the whisper stopped. The forest fell deathly silent again. The weight inside Jesse's skull lifted. The figures stood still, frozen like statues. Jenna panted, gripping his arm, her entire body trembling. What just happened? Jesse swallowed hard, staring at the unmoving figures, at the silent forest. The absence of sound was almost worse than the whisper itself. "They stopped," he muttered. "But why?" Jenna shook her head. "I don't know." "But Jesse," She turned her gaze to the trees. The path ahead of them was clear. The well was gone. The figures were still there watching, but for the first time, the forest itself seemed to be letting them go. Jesse wasn't sure whether that was a mercy or a warning. Jesse and Jenna stood in the unnatural silence, their breath shallow, their bodies unwilling to move despite the path ahead finally opening. The whispering had stopped, but its absence felt wrong, as though something had merely paused rather than disappeared. The figures remained motionless, their elongated forms now statues against the blackened trees. Jesse took a tentative step forward. The forest did not shift. The figures did not move. "Do we go?" Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. Jesse nodded, though uncertainty churned inside him. "We don't have a choice." Each step forward was deliberate, careful. The ground felt different beneath them, less like the damp, rotting earth of before and more solid, as if they were walking on something else, something not meant to be seen. Jenna stayed close, her fingers clutching Jesse's sleeve like a lifeline. The figures did not follow, but Jesse could feel their gaze. Not just on his skin, but inside him, as if they were watching the thoughts forming in his mind. The whispering had tried to burrow into their heads before, but this was different. It was colder, more calculating. Then, without warning, the trees around them blinked out of existence. Jesse stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. One moment, the darkened trunks stretched endlessly in every direction. Then, in an instant, they were gone. There was no fade, no transition, just nothingness. An empty, inky void where the forest had been. Jenna gasped, her grip tightening on his arm. "Where what?" Jesse turned, looking back the way they had come. The figures were still standing right where they had left them, except now there was no forest behind them. No trees, no well, just blackness, stretching endlessly like a hollow sky with no stars. The only thing that remained was the narrow path beneath their feet. Jesse's pulse thundered in his ears. The world wasn't shifting anymore. The world was vanishing. "We have to move," he said quickly. "Now." Jenna nodded, but terror widened her eyes. There was nowhere to go except forward. The silence stretched as they walked, each step echoing into the nothingness as if the void itself were swallowing all sound. The air felt thinner here, lighter. Jesse wasn't sure if they were still in the forest at all. Then ahead of them, something new appeared. It was a house. Small, aged, with warped wooden planks and a slanted roof. The single window was dark, the front door slightly ajar. It should not have been here. It should not have been anywhere. Jenna stopped beside him. "Jesse, that house." He didn't need her to finish. He already knew. It was his grandfather's house. The same one that had burned down 20 years ago. The sight of the house struck Jesse with an almost physical force. His chest tightened, the very air around him thickening, as if the forest itself were pressing in on him. The small, crooked house stood there, just beyond the path, as though it had never burned, as though it had never fallen to the flames that had ravaged it all those years ago. Jesse could still remember the day he had come home to find the charred remnants of his grandfather's life scattered across the yard, the smell of smoke still clinging to everything. But here it was, intact, as though untouched by time. Jenna's voice broke the silence, soft and disbelieving. "Jesse, this is your grandfather's house?" Jesse nodded, though his heart was pounding. He couldn't bring himself to speak. He wanted to turn away, to ignore it, to keep walking toward the unknown. But the house called to him, a pull in his gut that made him take an involuntary step forward. He didn't want to go. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave it behind. But there was something undeniably magnetic about it, something that whispered to him. No, it demanded that he understand, that he confront what had been buried, what had never truly gone away. Jenna's hand fell from his arm, and she stepped forward as well, though her movements were tentative, unsure. "We shouldn't go in there, Jesse," she said, her voice edged with fear. "Something's wrong." But Jesse, almost against his will, took another step forward. The door stood open, welcoming. The dark window, devoid of light, seemed to pull at him, as though it was the eye of something that had been watching him for far longer than he cared to think. "Jesse," Jenna's voice quivered now, almost pleading, but it was too late. His feet had already carried him to the door, and despite every protest, every warning echoing in his mind, he reached out and touched the cold handle. The metal was slick with moisture, but it didn't feel like rust. It felt like something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that made his skin crawl. Without another word, he twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, and the air inside the house smelled like dust and stale memories. The interior was just as he remembered. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath his feet, and the furniture, though covered with sheets, stood as it had years ago. The living room was shrouded in a half-darkness, with only the faintest light filtering in from the cracks in the walls. There was no sign of the flames, no evidence that this place had been reduced to ash. Jenna stood behind him now, hesitant but unwilling to let him go alone. "This isn't real, Jesse," she whispered. "It can't be." But Jesse couldn't speak. His eyes were drawn to the far end of the room, where the shadow of someone stood, barely visible in the gloom. A figure unmoving. His pulse quickened. He knew that shape. He knew that presence. It was his grandfather. He could feel his heart stop. The figure was still, its back to him, but Jesse knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was him. There was no mistaking it. His grandfather, the man who had raised him, the man who had been lost to the fire, was standing in that house as if nothing had ever happened. As if time had skipped a beat and returned him to this place, this moment. Jenna's breath caught beside him. "Jesse, we need to go. This isn't real. We need to leave." But Jesse couldn't move. His feet were frozen to the floor, as if an invisible force held him in place. The air grew colder, the shadows in the room deepening. And then the figure turned. It was his grandfather's face, but it was wrong. The eyes were sunken, the skin too pale, stretched tight over the bones. There was a hunger in those eyes, something predatory, something that was not his grandfather at all. And before Jesse could react, the figure's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Just the faintest of whispers, so soft, so quiet. It might have been imagined, but the words were clear in his mind. "It's too late." The words reverberated in Jesse's mind like an unshakable echo, and the air around him thickened, suffocating his thoughts. "It's too late," the figure whispered, though its mouth remained unmoving, a grotesque imitation of his grandfather's voice. The chill that had filled the room now pressed against him, sinking into his bones, making his skin feel like ice. His heart pounded, a frantic rhythm in his chest, but his feet remained frozen. Jenna's grip tightened on his arm, but even she seemed to be struggling with an unseen force. Her breath shallow, her face pale as the realization settled in. "Jesse, we need to get out of here. Now." Her voice quivered, barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might provoke something worse. But Jesse could not move. His eyes were locked on the figure, still staring back at him with those hollow, soulless eyes. They were not the eyes of a man who had lived, who had passed away. They were the eyes of something far older, something that had never truly left the house. Jesse's mind screamed for him to look away, to run, but he couldn't. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, as though the house itself was bending and warping, the walls groaning in protest. The dark corners of the room stretched impossibly long, swallowing the light. The figure's form began to blur, its body rippling like water, as though it were not entirely solid. Jesse's breath hitched in his throat. The house was not just a place, it was a prison, an entity in itself, breathing with them, watching them. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, and Jesse felt an unbearable pressure, an unseen force pushing down on him. It wasn't physical, it was worse. It was like his very mind was being crushed, as though something unseen was clawing at his thoughts, tearing through them, trying to reach the core of his being. He could feel his memories slipping away, replaced with images of nothingness, cold, dark voids that had no shape, no substance. Jenna screamed. The sound shattered the silence, but it wasn't enough to break through the oppressive weight pressing down on them. Jesse gasped for air, his chest heaving as the pressure increased. His mind was reeling, swirling in confusion and terror, but one thought managed to pierce through the chaos. It was all a lie. He had come here thinking he could confront the past, thinking he could understand the disappearance of his grandfather, the fire, the well, but now he realized it had been a trap from the very beginning. This house, the path, the figures in the forest, they were never meant to reveal the truth. They were designed to consume it. And Jesse was the prey. In the blink of an eye, the figure was gone, vanishing like smoke in the air, leaving behind only the oppressive silence and the feeling of something watching from the shadows. Jesse collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, the pressure lifting but leaving him disoriented. Jenna was crouching beside him now, her face pale, her hands shaking. "We need to get out of here," she urged, her voice tight with fear, but Jesse couldn't move. He wasn't sure how long they stayed there, in that suffocating stillness, the air so heavy it felt like it would collapse around them. All Jesse could hear was the rush of blood in his ears, the sound of his pulse slowing, but never fully calming. It was as if the house itself was waiting, watching, knowing they were still there. Finally, Jesse managed to get to his feet. He turned toward the door, but something caught his eye, something in the corner. It was subtle at first, like a shadow flickering in his peripheral vision, but as he focused, he saw it more clearly. The walls were no longer plain. They were etched with symbols, intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with life, shifting and rearranging themselves like an ancient language. Jesse felt an odd sense of recognition, though he couldn't say why. "Jenna," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Look at the walls." Jenna turned, her face tightening in confusion, but when she saw the symbols, her eyes widened in horror. She backed away slowly, her mouth dry. "Jesse, this isn't just a house. This place is alive." Jesse nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in like a cold stone. This house, this nightmare, was not just a physical place. It was something else entirely, something far older, something that thrived on fear, on memories, on regret. The walls, the floors, the very air, they had been waiting for them to step inside. And now that they were trapped. The moment Jesse and Jenna stepped outside the house, the weight of the air lifted slightly, but only enough to make breathing a little easier. The silence of the surrounding woods felt oppressive in its own way. The dark trees towered above them, each shadow seeming to stretch and twist unnaturally. It was as though the forest itself was waiting, just as the house had been. Jesse could still hear the whispers in his mind, the cold, guttural voice of his grandfather, or what he thought had been his grandfather, telling him that it was too late. The words lingered like smoke in his consciousness, too clear to ignore. They were the final warning, the mark of something far worse than he could have imagined. Jenna clutched his arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Jesse, we need to leave. This place, it's wrong. Everything about it feels wrong." Her voice trembled, but she was insistent. "We can't stay here." Jesse could hear the desperation in her voice, but he couldn't bring himself to move. There was something about the house, something about the force that had pressed down on him inside, that held him in place. It was as if it had marked him, bound him to that house and the forest around it. There was a part of him that knew they couldn't leave. Not until they understood what had happened. Not until they unraveled the truth buried in this forsaken place. He turned toward the woods, his eyes scanning the darkened trees. He remembered the stories his grandfather had told him. Stories of a deep well, buried beneath the earth, hidden from the world. A well so old that even the forest couldn't recall its origins. It was a place his grandfather had always warned him to avoid, though Jesse had never quite understood why. Now, standing at the edge of the forest, with the house looming behind him like a sleeping beast, Jesse began to realize that the well was the key. Whatever force had taken root in that house, whatever darkness had trapped his grandfather's spirit, it all led to the well. It was the heart of the curse. "We can't just leave," Jesse said, his voice low, almost hollow. "We need to find it, the well. It's the only way we'll understand what's really going on here." Jenna's eyes searched his face for a moment, as though weighing the truth of his words. She was clearly scared, but Jesse saw a flicker of resolve in her expression. She wasn't going to let him go alone, not after everything they'd already encountered. "Then let's find it," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor that still lingered. They pushed forward, entering the dark embrace of the woods. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows deepening. Jesse's mind raced with the fragments of his grandfather's stories, the cryptic warnings that had seemed like nothing more than old, superstitious ramblings. But now they were real. They weren't just words. They were a map, and the path they had to follow was dark and twisted. The forest was dense, its thick canopy cutting off much of the sky. The trees were ancient, gnarled, their trunks twisted like the hands of old men, their roots snaking into the earth like veins. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became. It wasn't just the cold that weighed on them now. It was the sense of something watching, something that knew they were there. Jesse could feel his skin crawl, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. It didn't take long before they found it, the well. It was hidden beneath a dense thicket of brambles, overgrown with vines that had choked out any trace of the stone that had once been its foundation. The well itself was a jagged hole in the earth, its edges eroded and worn by years of neglect. The stone lip was cracked, and the depth was impossible to gauge. Even in the darkness, Jesse could see the faint glimmer of something deep within, something unnatural. Jenna hesitated, her eyes scanning the area. "I don't like this, Jesse. Something feels wrong about it. We should go back." Jesse didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved closer to the edge of the well, his breath catching in his throat. It was as if the well was calling to him, a pull that he couldn't resist. He could feel the weight of the curse in the air, a presence that had been buried here for centuries, waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb it. He knelt down beside the well and peered into the abyss below, the darkness so thick it felt alive. And then he saw it, something moving, something in the depths of the well. It was brief, a flicker of movement, but it was enough to make his heart stop. Something was down there, something that shouldn't be. "Jesse, don't," Jenna whispered urgently, her hand on his shoulder. "We don't know what's down there. We need to leave." But Jesse couldn't tear his eyes away. "It's here," he murmured. "It's been here all along." The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and suddenly the air felt charged, as though something was stirring in the depths of the earth. The ground around the well trembled, just enough for Jesse to feel it in his bones. He stood up quickly, backing away from the edge. "What's happening?" Jenna's voice was tight with fear. Before Jesse could respond, a low, guttural sound erupted from the well, like a growl or a scream, distorted and incomprehensible. The noise was deafening, like the very earth was shaking with fury. The vines around the well began to twitch, as though something beneath the earth was pulling them, trying to break free. And then a hand, pale, elongated, and skeletal, emerged from the well, its fingers gripping the edge like a trap. Jesse's blood ran cold. The hand pulled, and with it came the unmistakable sound of something ancient rising, something trapped in the darkness for far too long. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could comprehend. Jenna screamed, pulling him away from the edge, but Jesse stood frozen, his gaze locked on the figure emerging from the well. Whatever it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The earth shook beneath their feet, the tremors pulsating through the soil, reverberating in their bones. Jesse could hear the low, guttural growls of whatever was coming from the depths of the well, the sounds growing louder as the hand pulled itself higher, followed by a spine-chilling whisper that seemed to seep into his very soul. It wasn't a language, at least not one Jesse could understand, but it was full of menace, something primal and ancient, as if the very earth had been corrupted by it. Jenna's grip tightened on his arm, but Jesse remained frozen, his gaze transfixed on the hand, now clawing its way out of the well. It wasn't like any human hand he had ever seen. The fingers were unnaturally long, too thin, and their skin was like decaying parchment, stretched taut over a skeletal framework. It trembled as it reached for the surface, and for a moment, Jesse thought he could see a faint, twisted smile at the edge of the well, a grotesque thing made not by human features, but by something far worse. Jenna yanked at his arm, pulling him back. "Jesse, we have to go now." Her voice was frantic, sharp with fear, but Jesse couldn't look away. His mind raced, a part of him screaming that this was a mistake, that they should run, but another part, a darker, more insidious part, urged him to stay, to understand, to see what was coming. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for them. It had been waiting for him. "No," Jesse finally managed to say, his voice hoarse and thick with disbelief. "It's here. It's been here all along. I have to know what it wants." Jenna stumbled back, eyes wide with terror. "You're insane. This isn't something we can understand." Her voice trembled, as though even saying the words aloud would make them more real. She stepped back again, glancing at the woods, at the house behind them. "We need to leave. This is more than we can handle, Jesse." But Jesse didn't move. His body felt as though it were rooted to the ground, as if something was holding him there, pressing down on him with the weight of centuries. The hand from the well continued to rise, and Jesse could now see something else, something worse. The outline of a face began to take shape from the shadows deep within the well. The eyes, dark, empty voids, locked onto him, and he felt a sudden rush of coldness that stole the breath from his lungs. The being that had been buried here was alive, and it was no longer content to remain hidden. A voice, smooth and slick like oil, oozed from the well, wrapping around him like a coil. "You should never have come," it hissed, its words sinking into Jesse's mind. "You've awakened what should never have been disturbed." Jenna stumbled backward in horror, her mouth opening and closing as though she were trying to scream, but no sound emerged. She looked at Jesse, her expression one of both fear and betrayal, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature emerging from the well. The more he looked, the more details he saw. The twisted body that followed the hand, the long, clawed feet scraping the stones of the well's edge. It was humanoid, but something about it felt utterly wrong. The skin was too pale, too stretched, and as it emerged fully into the moonlight, its form seemed to shift, as though it were made of shadows and nightmares rather than flesh. "It wants me," Jesse said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. He couldn't look away. "It wants me, or something from me." "No!" Jenna cried, panic rising in her voice. "You're not yourself, Jesse. This thing, whatever it is, it's using you." But Jesse's thoughts were elsewhere. The creature's eyes, those bottomless voids, seemed to pull at something deep within him. It was as if it knew him, as though it had been waiting for his arrival. He could feel it calling to him, drawing him in, filling the empty places within him with dark promises of power and knowledge. He felt his pulse quicken, his breath shallow, as the world around him seemed to distort. "I can't leave," he muttered, his voice distant, as though someone else were speaking through him. "It needs me, and I need it." "No!" Jenna's voice cracked. "This is not you, Jesse. You gotta fight this. We're getting out of here, together, right now." Her words barely reached him. Jesse could see the creature now, fully risen from the well, its long limbs stretching unnaturally as it unfolded into the night. Its body seemed to flicker, as if it wasn't entirely solid, as if it were made of both shadows and flesh, bound together by some unholy force. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged, pointed teeth, and a voice, deeper and more terrifying than the one before, boomed out. "You are mine now," it growled, its tone filled with malice and hunger. "The well has waited too long. It has claimed what it desired, and you will be its final servant. Your blood will feed it. Your soul will nourish it." Jesse's vision blurred. He could feel the pull, the dark power radiating from the creature. He felt it sink into his skin, creeping into his veins, poisoning his thoughts. His knees buckled, but he remained upright, his body trembling as the creature's power began to suffuse him. Jenna screamed, running forward to try and drag him away, but before she could reach him, the creature moved with terrifying speed. Its clawed hand shot out, gripping her wrist and jerking her toward it with an unnatural strength. Jesse watched in a daze as Jenna struggled, her face contorted with fear and pain. "Jenna!" Jesse shouted, his voice desperate, but the words felt distant, as though they came from someone else's mouth. He could feel himself slipping away. The creature's grip on his mind was tightening, pulling him into its grasp. He was losing himself. And then, in the distance, a sudden light, a flicker of movement in the trees. Something else was there, someone who had seen the situation unfold, but whether they would arrive in time was another question. The air had grown still, thick with the weight of impending doom. The creature that had clawed its way out of the well towered above them, its form shifting with unnatural fluidity, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch far beyond the trees. Jenna, still struggling in its grasp, fought valiantly, but the creature's hold was too strong. It was as though the very ground beneath them was complicit in its power, as if the earth itself was aiding in their torment. Jesse stood there, immobilized, watching in a detached trance. He could feel the creature's words crawling under his skin, like insects burrowing into his mind. The creature had told him he was its final servant, that his blood would feed it and his soul would nourish it. These words echoed in his thoughts like a hypnotic chant, breaking through the panic that threatened to overtake him. But the more he listened, the more those words seemed to make sense. There was no escape. He was already a part of the well's cursed legacy, and it was too late for him to resist. His body trembled as the darkness of the creature's presence sank deeper into him, pulling him into a well of cold emptiness. He wanted to scream, to call out for help, but the words were trapped in his throat. A part of him still wanted to fight, to free Jenna, but another part, darker, deeper, was willing to surrender to the creature's promise. "Jesse, please." Jenna's voice broke through his haze, sharp and desperate. She was still trying to break free, but the creature's grip had tightened, and it was clear that her efforts were in vain. "You can fight this. Don't let it take you." But the more Jenna pleaded, the harder it became for Jesse to focus. The creature's presence, its voice, was overpowering. The shadows that enveloped the creature seemed to extend like tendrils, reaching for Jesse, wrapping around his mind. He could feel the darkness seeping into his veins, spreading through his blood like a virus, infecting his every thought. The creature, its eyes glowing with a malicious light, spoke again, its voice now a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in the air. "She is nothing. You are mine now. You will join me in the depths, and together we will spread the curse that has lain dormant for so long." Jesse's breath caught in his chest, and for a fleeting moment, the thought of turning back, a desperate, final cry for sanity, pulsed in his mind. But it was immediately drowned out by the overwhelming weight of the creature's influence. He felt it coil around his thoughts like an unrelenting vice, squeezing, twisting, until there was no room left for resistance. Jenna's cries grew more frantic as she struggled in the creature's grip, her body writhing in a futile attempt to escape. But the creature's strength was too great, and it was pulling her closer, its jagged teeth glistening in the pale light of the moon. Jesse could hear the soft, sickening sound of the creature's breath as it inhaled, savoring the terror it instilled in its victims. It was feeding off their fear, and Jesse realized with a sickening sense of dread that he was no longer entirely in control of his thoughts. Then, in a sudden burst of clarity, a sharp memory broke through the haze. The journal. The cryptic notes that had been left behind by the previous inhabitants of the house. They had known about the well, about the curse, about the creature. The well was no ordinary well. It was a prison, a containment vessel for something far worse than anything Jesse could have imagined. The people who had once lived here had sealed it away, hoping that it would never be released. But now, the seal was broken. Jesse's eyes flickered toward the house, toward the distant figures now rushing toward them. He could see the flicker of movement, the silhouettes emerging from the trees. His mind raced. Who were they? Was it too late for them to help? The creature's grip on him was tightening, but a new voice, a new presence had entered the fray. A faint glimmer of hope began to spark within him. Could they save him? Could they save Jenna? The creature, sensing his shift in focus, turned its empty gaze toward the new arrivals. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing more rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The darkness around it seemed to pulse in time with its heartbeat. It had sensed the new threat, but its confidence remained unshaken. Jesse could feel it preparing for another attack, the air thickening with malevolent energy. But the new figures, whoever they were, didn't seem intimidated. They moved quickly, purposefully, and Jesse could see that they were armed. Though with what, he couldn't be sure. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble, as if the earth itself were holding its breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would play out. Jenna's voice, ragged with fear, called to him again. "Jesse, don't listen to it. You're stronger than this." Her words pierced through the fog of darkness clouding his mind, but they only seemed to come from a distant place. He wasn't sure if he could trust them. The creature had planted a seed of doubt deep in his mind, and now every word seemed to be part of some twisted game. Then, the figures were upon them. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, strode forward with a confidence that Jesse envied. They raised a long, sharp object, perhaps a spear or something like it, and aimed it at the creature. The air seemed to hum with tension as the two forces collided, the creature's hiss of fury filling the night. Jesse felt the grip on his mind loosen, just for a moment, as the new arrivals engaged the creature. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt the slightest flicker of control return. His breath quickened as he realized that they might be able to stop it. He might still have a chance to fight back. But as the creature screeched, thrashing against its attackers, a terrifying thought struck him. He wasn't sure who would come out of this alive. The battle between the creature and the strangers had reached a fever pitch. Every swing of the makeshift weapon, whether it was a spear or some ancient tool Jesse couldn't quite comprehend, struck with an unnatural force, sending ripples of energy through the air. The creature recoiled, its inhuman shrieks echoing through the trees, but it was far from defeated. The dark, swirling mass of its form seemed to stretch and reshape with every blow, morphing into something more sinister with each passing moment. Jesse, still caught in the creature's grasp, felt an odd sense of detachment, like he was watching the events unfold from a distant place. The bond he had forged with the creature, the darkness that had settled deep within him, was weakening, but not without leaving a mark. He could feel its presence lingering, like a shadow that refused to leave, seeping deeper into his bones. Yet, in the chaos of the moment, he realized he was no longer entirely bound by its will. Jenna's struggles continued, her body writhing in the creature's grip, but she was not without hope. He saw the fierce determination in her eyes, a fire that refused to be extinguished. She had not given up, and neither could he. As much as the creature's influence had burrowed its way into his soul, he knew that if there was any chance for escape, it lay in the strength of their resolve. Together, they might still break free. The strangers fought valiantly, moving with a precision and skill that was almost otherworldly. Their leader, tall and commanding, directed the others with an ease that suggested they had faced such horrors before. But the creature was relentless, and each strike seemed to only feed its rage. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light as it retaliated, claws slashing through the air. Jesse, despite the mental fog that clouded his thoughts, felt a shift in the air. Something was wrong. He didn't know what it was at first, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a subtle shift in the energy that surrounded them all. It wasn't just the creature. They were not the only players in this game. There was an unseen hand guiding the chaos, pulling the strings in a way that left Jesse with an unsettling feeling in his gut. In that moment, he remembered the journal, the cryptic writings that had led him to this cursed well, to this nightmare. He had thought the journal was a map, a guide to understanding the creature's power. But now, he wondered if it had been something else entirely, a warning perhaps from those who had known too much. The truth was far darker than he had realized. The creature's screech echoed again, a sound so high-pitched it seemed to cut through the very fabric of reality. The strangers paused, their faces contorted in a mixture of fear and determination. They had come prepared, that much was clear, but even their weapons seemed insufficient against the creature's raw, ancient power. Jesse could see that they were stalling, not defeating. There was a deeper truth to their mission, something they hadn't yet revealed. Jenna's voice broke through his reverie, filled with urgency. "Jesse, you have to fight it. Don't let it win. We're so close." Her words, though tinged with fear, still held a strength that pierced through the growing darkness. She was right. They were close. Close to either escaping or being consumed forever by the creature and the curse that had bound it to this land. Jesse shook his head, as if waking from a trance. The creature's grip on his mind had loosened, and he felt the weight of its influence recede. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could think clearly. He could see the situation for what it was, an ancient, insidious force that thrived on fear and despair. It had taken root in him, but it could still be stopped. He glanced at the strangers, who were now engaged in a desperate standoff with the creature. They had uncovered something important, something that Jesse couldn't yet grasp. The dark energy surrounding the creature had a source, a central point of control that they had not yet reached. The creature, despite its monstrous form and relentless attacks, was being controlled. Its power was tethered to something else. It was then that Jesse saw it. The well. The massive, forgotten structure that had once seemed like nothing more than a relic of the past was more than that. It was the anchor, the source of the creature's power. The creature's movements grew erratic, its form stretching and distorting as if struggling against some unseen force. Its connection to the well was what gave it life, and without it, the creature would be nothing more than a shadow in the dark. Jesse's heart raced as the realization dawned upon him. They needed to destroy the well. The creature's strength was tied to it, and if they could sever that connection, they could defeat it once and for all. But how? The stranger's weapons had been ineffective, and the creature's power was far beyond anything Jesse could comprehend. They needed something more, something that would sever the bond between the creature and the well. As if answering his unspoken thought, the stranger's leader turned toward the well, his eyes narrowing with grim understanding. He had known this truth all along. Without a word, he gestured to the others, signaling them to retreat. The creature, sensing their movement, let out a guttural roar, but it did not follow. It remained rooted to the spot, its gaze flicking between them and the well. Jesse's eyes followed the leader's gaze, and for the first time, he understood the depth of the trap they were all caught in. The creature was not just a monster. It was a manifestation of something much darker, a force of nature that fed on despair and fear. And the well was its prison, its anchor to the physical world. The leader turned back to the group, his voice low and filled with resolve. "We need to break the seal. It's the only way to stop this. And to do that, we'll have to face whatever's inside." Jesse felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He had thought they had been fighting the creature all along, but now he realized that the true battle had only just begun. The well was not just a place of confinement. It was a doorway, a passage to something far worse. And they were about to open it. The realization hit Jesse like a cold wave crashing over him, chilling him to his core. The well, that ancient, forgotten structure they had once seen as the source of all their terror, was not merely a prison. It was a gateway. A gateway to something far darker, a force far older than they could fathom. As the strangers moved with calculated urgency, preparing for whatever lay ahead, Jesse couldn't shake the gnawing sense of dread that had settled deep within him. The creature, no longer merely an adversary, but a manifestation of some primal force, had been held in check by the well, its power tethered to the earth in a twisted, binding ritual. For generations, it had remained trapped, feeding off the fear of those who dared to approach, yet unable to escape. But now, with the seal weakening, something darker stirred, something that had been waiting. Jesse's eyes darted between the strangers and the well. The leader, his face grim and hardened by experiences Jesse couldn't even begin to imagine, moved with purpose. Every step seemed deliberate, as if he had seen this scenario play out 1,000 times before. He knew what had to be done, and though he had a plan, the fear in his eyes was undeniable. This wasn't just about stopping the creature. It was about preventing the escape of a force that had been imprisoned for centuries. Jenna, still struggling with the remnants of the creature's influence, stood beside him. Her breathing was labored, her hands shaking as she gripped her weapon. Despite the exhaustion in her eyes, she refused to back down. The connection between them, forged in the heart of that hellish experience, had made them allies in a battle far bigger than either had ever anticipated. Yet, there was still something holding her back, a hesitation that Jesse couldn't place, a reluctance to face whatever lay beneath the surface of the well. As the strangers set to work, placing strange, intricate symbols around the base of the well, Jesse tried to push aside the terror that threatened to consume him. They were preparing for something monumental, but no one spoke of what would happen once the seal was broken. Would it destroy the creature? Or would it release something far worse, something that they couldn't even begin to comprehend? The well itself had started to pulse with a low, vibrating hum. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, as if the earth itself was alive, reacting to the changes. The creature, though still a formidable force, seemed less focused now. It had been watching the preparations, its glowing eyes flicking between the strangers and the well. As the symbols were completed, the hum grew louder, vibrating through their bones. The air grew thick with tension, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Jesse glanced at the leader again, who was now muttering under his breath, his hands moving in fluid, ritualistic motions. Every action he took seemed to be drawing on some unseen power, something that was both terrifying and oddly beautiful in its intensity. The stranger's companions, standing in silent formation, looked ready for whatever might come next, but even they seemed to recognize that this moment was one of finality. No one would leave unscathed. But even as the ritual reached its climax, Jesse felt a pull deep within himself, an invisible tether to the well that seemed to echo through his chest. His connection to the creature, weakened but still present, was like a chain that refused to break. He was terrified of what would happen if the seal was broken. The creature might be released, yes, but that would only be the beginning. Something else, something older and more dangerous, lurked beneath the surface. "Jesse!" Jenna's voice broke through his thoughts, filled with desperation. "We have to act now. You're still connected to it. You have to help us." Her eyes, wide and frantic, pleaded with him, and Jesse felt the weight of her words settle heavily in his heart. She was right. The connection he still had to the creature wasn't just a weakness. It was a lifeline. And if he didn't use it, they would all be lost. In that moment, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The well's hum grew deafening, and the air around them seemed to warp and twist. The creature let out a shriek that rattled the bones of everyone present. It was as if the well was finally being breached, its centuries-old seal no longer able to contain what was inside. Jesse's heart raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could feel it, the creature's power, and he could feel something else, something deeper beginning to emerge. Without thinking, Jesse stepped forward, ignoring the pull of the creature's influence that tugged at the back of his mind. He moved toward the well, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stop," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the creature's rage. "We can't just break the seal. It'll destroy everything." The leader of the strangers paused, his face unreadable. His eyes flicked toward Jesse, then back at the well. There was a brief moment of hesitation before he spoke, his voice calm, but filled with a somber understanding. "It's already too late," he said. "The well's power can't be contained anymore. We either break the seal now, or it'll break us." The words sent a chill down Jesse's spine. There was no escape now. They had already entered the point of no return. The well was opening, and whatever came out of it would be their new reality. With a deep breath, Jesse closed his eyes, letting the bond between him and the creature resurface, guiding his next move. His hand reached for the center of the ritual, breaking the pattern that had been so carefully drawn. It was a desperate gamble, a chance to disrupt the ritual, to keep whatever was inside the well contained, or to risk letting it all spill out into the world. As his hand touched the center of the ritual's pattern, a sudden, deafening silence fell over the clearing. The creature's roar, the tremor in the ground, the humming of the well, everything stopped. The world held its breath, and for one fleeting moment, Jesse thought they might have succeeded. But then, the well began to crack. The crack that split the surface of the well was a sound Jesse would never forget. A sharp, dry noise that seemed to tear through the fabric of the world itself. It was as though time itself had momentarily fractured. The earth beneath their feet shook with such intensity that Jesse felt his legs give way beneath him. His body was thrown to the ground, his face scraping against the dirt, and the very air around them seemed to twist and distort, warping with the force of something ancient and powerful being unleashed. For a brief moment, everything stopped. There was no sound, no motion, just an eerie stillness, as if the universe itself had paused in apprehension. Then, without warning, the surface of the well began to crumble. Pieces of rock and earth disintegrated into dust, and the center of the well, the heart of the ritual, split open, revealing what lay beneath. It was not the creature that Jesse had feared. What emerged from the depths was far more terrifying. An enormous black void, swirling with unrecognizable shapes and colors that seemed to warp the very laws of nature. It was not a thing that could be comprehended by human senses. Jesse could feel its presence, a cold, gnawing absence that filled the air with a suffocating weight. It was not a monster, not in the way they had envisioned it. It was something older, something that existed beyond the known world, beyond human understanding. Jesse struggled to regain his bearings, his eyes locked on the swirling void that was consuming the well space. The ground beneath him continued to tremble as the void seemed to pull at everything in its path. Trees, rocks, even the air itself. It was as though the world was beginning to fold into itself, drawn into the black abyss that now pulsed in the heart of the clearing. And yet, the most disturbing part was the sensation it left behind. It wasn't just the physical destruction, but the deep, gnawing terror that seemed to sink into the very marrow of their bones, making them question not just their survival, but the very nature of their reality. Is this what was inside? Jenna's voice broke through the quiet panic that had seized Jesse's mind. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had fought alongside him, had endured the creature's relentless pursuit, but now she was faced with something far worse. This is not possible. It's like it's alive. The leader of the strangers, who had been standing at the center of the ritual, now staggered back, his face ashen with shock. His lips moved, though no sound seemed to emerge at first. Slowly, he found his voice. It's not the creature you think it is. The well, it was never meant to contain it. We thought it was bound, but it was never truly imprisoned. What was inside? It is beyond this world. Jesse could barely comprehend the magnitude of the words. It wasn't just the creature that had been trapped. There had been something far greater, a force so ancient that it defied explanation. Whatever it was not of this world. It was not of any world that human beings had ever known. The ritual, the symbols, the seals, they had only served as a temporary measure, a last-ditch attempt to contain a force far beyond their ability to control. Then what do we do? Jesse asked, his voice hoarse, barely able to speak over the overwhelming pressure of the void. It's tearing everything apart. The leader didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the void, his mind racing as he searched for a solution that seemed increasingly impossible. We can't contain it, he finally admitted. The ritual was only meant to buy us time. The well wasn't supposed to be the prison. It was a marker, a warning to keep people away. But now, he trailed off, his words hanging in the air. Jesse's stomach twisted as the reality of their situation sank in. There was no way out. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The force that had been trapped for centuries had now been set free, and there was no returning to the life they once knew. The world, as they had understood it, had just begun to unravel, and they were helpless to stop it. Around them, the landscape began to change. The trees, once solid and towering, seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The ground cracked open, large fissures appearing where there had been none moments before. Above them, the sky darkened, swirling with unnatural clouds, and Jesse felt a deep, primal fear surge within him. The world, the very nature of existence, was warping and bending, as though it were no longer held together by the same laws of nature that they had once taken for granted. Jenna stepped closer to him, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "We're not going to survive this, are we?" Her words, though spoken softly, felt like a death sentence. She had always been strong, but now, the weight of the situation was too much for even her to bear. Jesse couldn't answer. He didn't know. He couldn't understand what was happening, let alone how to stop it. He looked around at the strangers, at the leader, but none of them seemed to have any more answers than he did. They were all trapped, watching helplessly as the world crumbled before their eyes. And then, as the void pulsed again, something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a flicker of light from deep within the abyss. But then it grew, the energy intensifying until it was like a pressure building in the air, pushing down on them, crushing them under its weight. The ground beneath their feet buckled as the void seemed to expand, its tendrils reaching out and consuming everything in its path. The world seemed to bend and twist with each passing moment, becoming more unrecognizable by the second. Jesse's heart raced as he realized the truth. The well had never been a prison. It had been a warning, and now they were living in the aftermath of their ignorance. The world as they knew it was no longer stable. Whatever force had been sealed away was now free, and there was no telling how far its reach would go. The balance had been destroyed, and in its place, there was only chaos. The destruction was only just beginning. As the void expanded further, Jesse's thoughts raced. Could they fight back? Could they do anything? The answer seemed as distant as the stars above, fading further away with every moment that passed. The world was unraveling, and they were powerless to stop it. The void, once contained within the forgotten well, had grown beyond anything Jesse had feared. It was no longer just an anomaly or an ancient presence from another world. It had become a consuming force that was rewriting the very rules of existence. As the blackness spread further, it did not merely destroy, it transformed. The world around them warped in ways that defied logic, bending the laws of nature as if they were mere suggestions rather than immutable truths. The air grew thick, heavy with an oppressive weight that clung to their skin, making every breath a struggle. Jesse stood, frozen, his mind unable to process the magnitude of what they were facing. He could hear the distant sounds of the world falling apart, cracking, crumbling, and tearing at the seams. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the pressure in the air pushing down on him, as though the earth itself was being suffocated. Time had become unreliable, slipping and distorting in ways that were impossible to follow. One moment, the sky was filled with swirling black clouds, and the next, the sun burned with a strange, sickly light that seemed to pierce through the thickening fog. "It's the end," Jenna whispered beside him. Her voice was hoarse, strained, and her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She had seen the horrors beneath the surface, fought alongside him in the moments of terror that had followed, but nothing could have prepared them for this. This was not a monster, not even a demonic force. This was something older, a force that existed outside the very fabric of the universe, beyond the comprehension of anyone who had ever walked the earth. Jesse wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? They had all been so focused on stopping the creature, on preventing the ritual from being completed, that they had missed the true nature of the threat. They had never considered the possibility that the well was not meant to imprison a being, but to contain something far more dangerous. And now, it was free, unraveling everything in its wake. The leader, who had once held the knowledge to guide them, now stood silent. His face was pale, his body trembling with the weight of his failure. The ritual had been meant to protect them, to keep the ancient evil locked away, but it had failed. The seals had been broken, the void unleashed, and now there was no escape from the consequences. He could only stare into the swirling abyss, as though waiting for some divine intervention that was never coming. "There's nothing left," the leader said, his voice barely audible. "We thought we had control, that we could contain it. But we were wrong. The well, it wasn't meant to be a prison. It was a symbol, a warning. The force inside wasn't meant to be bound. It was never meant to be stopped." Jesse felt a hollow pit form in his stomach as the leader's words echoed through his mind. The well had never been a trap. It had been a marker, a reminder that some forces were too powerful to be contained. They were never meant to fight it. They were never meant to confront it. They had been trespassers in a place that was beyond human understanding, and now the world was paying the price. Jenna gripped his arm tighter. "What do we do now?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but the weight of her question hung heavily in the air. Jesse didn't have an answer. He didn't know if there was anything to do. Could they run? Could they fight? It seemed like everything they had known had already been undone. They were in a place now where survival was no longer a matter of will or strength. It was a matter of simply existing long enough to see the end. As the sky above them darkened, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble again, this time with a greater intensity. The once stable earth cracked open further, splitting wide as if the land itself were being undone. Jesse's eyes widened in terror as he realized that the void wasn't just affecting the area around them. It was spreading, growing larger with each passing second. They weren't just in danger of losing their lives. They were in danger of losing everything. The entire world was folding in on itself, being drawn into the black abyss that had once been hidden beneath the earth. "Run!" The leader finally managed to choke out, his voice ragged. But it was already too late. There was nowhere to run. The world was being pulled into the void, sucked into a fate that was beyond their control. The very air around them seemed to disintegrate, and Jesse could feel his body growing weaker, as if even his own flesh was being pulled into the dark emptiness. And then, with a deafening roar, the world shattered. The land broke apart, the sky collapsed in on itself, and the void consumed everything. There was no longer any distinction between the real and the unreal, the living and the dead. Time, space, and existence were no longer separate entities. They merged into a singularity, a moment in which everything and nothing coexisted. The world, once vibrant with life and light, was now a distant memory, swallowed by the void that had once been contained beneath the earth. Jesse's last thought was not one of fear, but of inevitability. They had always been too small, too fragile to face something like this. And now, as the void enveloped him, he realized the truth. Some forces were not meant to be understood. Some things were beyond the comprehension of human minds, beyond the reach of mortal hands. They had been foolish to believe they could stop it. They had been foolish to believe they had a chance. The world was collapsing, and in its place, there was only darkness. And then nothing. The story of the well, of the ritual, of the battle against an ancient and unknowable force, ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, suffocating embrace of oblivion. Everything was undone, lost to the void. The universe, in all its fragile beauty, had collapsed into the dark nothingness that had always been waiting.